Hello everyone. On behalf of the Office of Interdisciplinary Studies, Ideas, I welcome you all to today's masterclass with Dr. Sharmila Parmanand. Ideas is a university-wide platform committed to fostering interdisciplinary teaching and collaborative research across and beyond the schools and institutes of OP Jindal Global University. The office's flagship postgraduate program, that is MSc in Development Practice. It's a non-residential program, the classes of which are held in Jindal International Academy at the Taj facility of Jindal in New Delhi. The program has been conceptualized and designed to equip students with the tools and perspectives needed to engage with the complex, interconnected crises that shape life in the global south. We also have an MSc program, an online program in development studies that starts later this year in December. Our masterclass series is a core component of the MSc program. Each week, we invite leading scholars, practitioners, and policymakers from India and all across the world to share their experiences and help bridge the gap between classroom learning and the lived realities of development work. These sessions are not only an opportunity to learn from some of the most distinguished voices in the field, but also a space for dialogue, debate, and critical reflection on what development truly means in different contexts. Today, we have with us Dr. Sharmila Parmanand, Assistant Professor in Gender, Development, and Globalization at the Department of Gender Studies, London School of Economics and Political Science. She's also an Associate Academic at the LSC Soswi Hawk Southeast Asia Center and co-convener of the Development Studies Association Women and Development Study Group. Her research explores colonial histories and gendered logics shaping development and humanitarian interventions in the global south, with particular focus on migration, gender-based violence, precarious labor, economic restructuring, social protection, and the politics of knowledge production. Dr. Sharmila's talk today is titled Same but Different: Care, Domestic Work, and Sex Work in the Gendered Political Economy. This lecture brings care work, domestic work, and sex work into the same frame to examine how gender shapes the organization and value of labor. Across these sectors, women's work is essential yet systematically undervalued, regulated by sexual and moral norms, and framed through contested narratives of victimhood, agency, and choice. Tracing both the shared logics and distinct dynamics of these labors, the lecture interrogates how structural inequalities and intimate relations of power together shape women's work in the global economy. Dr. Sharmila will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, following which we'll have our two discussants, Dr. Deblina Day and Dr. Ruchira Sen, to share their remarks and reflections. Dr. Deblina is Associate Professor of Sociology at Jindal Global Law School and Assistant Director, Center for Law and Humanities at the Law School. I would also like to take a moment to congratulate her for the launch of the Care and Aging in Asia Research Network later today. Dr. Day is anchoring the network at the Center for Law and Humanities. Our second discussant, Dr. Ruchira Sen, is Associate Professor of Economics and Assistant Dean at Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. Her research interests are care work, gift economies, and the history of economic thought. She teaches data journalism and introductory economics. She has a PhD from the University of Missouri, Kansas City, and an MA and MPhil from JNU. So thank you so much for joining us today. I now invite Dr. Sharmila to deliver the lecture. Thank you once again.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prachi-Huda, for the generous introduction, and in advance to Dr. Deblina Day and Dr. Ruchira Sen for engaging with the lecture and for the invitation. I am very, very excited to be speaking with this group. I've prepared a few slides. All right, and I will keep to 30-ish minutes for this. So this lecture is entitled Same but Different: Care, Domestic Work, and Sex Work in the Gendered Political Economy. This is our agenda for today. I would like to give a brief context of my scholarship so you understand where I'm coming from when I approach this topic. So, my research context focus is usually Southeast Asia, primarily the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, and occasionally Vietnam. I work primarily with sex work organizations and domestic work organizations. And now that I am based in the UK, I also work with Filipino migrant domestic worker organizations in the UK. So it might be the case that some of the examples I referred to are quite specific to this region, but with broad applicability. So first, I'll define the terms that I'm using, but I will also emphasize that the language we use to describe these activities is quite political and contested. So even the act of defining is quite political. And then I'll explain why I'm trying to bring these three, divergent groups of activities of care, domestic work, and sex work into the same analytical frame because they're not necessarily the same, hence the title, right? But what I'm trying to do here in terms of generating new ways of thinking about them is what happens when we compare them, what surfaces in the comparison. And what I want to highlight here is how gender, of course, a very intersectional approach to gender here, how gender, as it interacts with other axes of inequality, how that shapes how labor is defined, organized, and valued in all of these cases. Again, the tagline of same but different. And then afterwards, I want to reflect a little bit on the prospects for worker solidarity. What are the challenges and potential across these sectors? Okay, so let's start by defining the terms. And as I've warned you, it is quite political, and there won't be universal definitions for these terms. And within each subfield, there is a lot of discussion and debate as well. So I've tried to capture some of that, but of course, that's going to be hard to do in a short lecture. So the most common definition of care I've encountered corresponds to Sue Himmelwhite's definition, which is the provision of personal services to meet those basic physical and mental needs that allow a person to function at a socially determined, acceptable level of capability, comfort, and safety, right? And of course, not everyone will have the same care needs. Now, this way of defining it has also been critiqued, even if this might not be Himmel White's intention, but Himmel White's background is she's a feminist economist, right? Has been critiqued for focusing a bit too much on functioning, right? On thinking of care instrumentally, providing care so people can function or people can be productive, which is which can be argued to be a bit of a neoliberal understanding of care. Is it really just about functioning? And so some scholars would insist on explicitly broadening this definition of care, right? And to say care is needed, care is a right, care is an entitlement, but care refers to all of these activities that sustain life and well-being. So it's not just about sustaining productivity or functioning, it's literally ensuring that life, culture, values, identities, well-being can be reproduced, right? So this is a bit more broad and expansive, and it resists kind of more instrumental framings of care or hierarchies of deservingness. What do I mean by this? Because in the original definition, when we talk about, you know, meeting physical and mental needs that allow a person to function at a socially determined, acceptable level, social norms come into play, right? And there are some social norms that say certain people, certain bodies are more deserving than others of care. So a view that says, no, no, it is about sustaining life and well-being and joy and pleasure is more expansive and inclusive. One debate within this field is to what extent do we include emotional labor under care? And the consensus of, I think, feminist scholars here is that falls under care work. So it's not just about physical work, but also emotional work. So examples of this would include dealing with conflict in the family, diffusing tensions, providing support, listening, offering advice, guidance, counsel, pastoral care. So these things are hard to measure, but they are forms of care, right? Care can be paid or unpaid, and it operates across all sectors of the economy. Another important thing about care that makes it different from other products or services is that it's not usually impersonal, or it's very hard for care to be impersonal because there's always some degree of intimacy involved between the person providing care and the person receiving care. And in some cases, there is a mutual kind of provision of care, right? So you cannot fully separate the person that is providing care from the output of that care, right? And so the formation and development of a relationship is crucial in in a care context, whether it be in the context of childcare, elder care, or disability care, which then means, care is also something that's very hard to mass produce because as you try to quote unquote increase the productivity, the quality significantly declines because the relational dimension becomes harder to sustain, right? The other issue with care, and this one is particularly salient for today's lecture, is it's often seen as intrinsically motivated. Uh, virtue is its own reward. And Nancy Folber writes about this, right? There's an assumption that it's okay that it's paid less because there's a psychic income that is derived. It makes us happy and it's rewarding and it's fulfilling, right? And hold on to that thought because I'll come back to that in a later section. Care burdens are also unevenly distributed. So care in terms of in both paid and unpaid, and care work also just tends to be devalued even when it is paid. And we'll again come back to that in a bit. So the next term, so keep that at the back of your mind. The next term is domestic work. And here I'm just borrowing from the International Labor Organization because I think they have the best wording that captures what I'm trying to get at in this lecture. So there is domestic work that is performed without pay, right? Like most of us at working age, maybe in some contexts, even people under 18, have performed some measure of domestic work, household cleaning and maintenance, prepping meals for household consumption, budgeting, caring for family members, including oneself, right? Now, the context in which I'm using domestic work here is more in a paid context. So, domestic workers are workers who work in the homes of others, sometimes full time, sometimes part time, for pay. So, providing a range of domestic services: sweeping, cleaning, washing clothes and dishes, shopping, cooking, caring for children or the elderly, the sick or the disabled, and or providing services such as gardening, driving, and security, which is actually quite an expansive definition because in some definitions, driving and security would be excluded because there is movement outside the house. But here, I already want you to start thinking about the overlaps between domestic work and care. And then finally, and this activity feels a bit more like the odd one out, but I think it's quite generative for us to try to put the three of them in the same analytical frame without suggesting that they are the same, of course not, but it might help us it might reveal certain logics that would not have been obvious if we think of them as separate, right? So this is the most contentious to define. So the language used to describe individuals who sell sexual services depends on whether one considers it work. So there is a very, very unresolved, heated debate on this. There will be a certain set of feminists. So Andrea Dworkin, Catherine McKinnon, Carol Pateman, the feminists who support the Nordic model in Sweden, sometimes they call it the equality model, who define prostitution or the sale of sex as trafficking, essentially. And what they're trying to emphasize by calling it trafficking is they are trying to emphasize the coercive dimension, right? So either fraud or direct coercion or the economic coercion or the abuse of the position of vulnerability of a person. So that's why they don't want the agent to be centered. What they are centering is what is being done to the person, right? So they tend to use terms like trafficking, individuals in prostitution, prostituted women, because there's a strong emphasis on women versus people who think that it is work. Now, the people who think that it's work, don't necessarily think that trafficking doesn't exist, right? Because trafficking also exists in factory work, in domestic work, in agricultural work, but that doesn't mean we don't call it work. We call the abusive incidents trafficking, but the other parts that don't meet the bar of trafficking are referred to as work, right? So there is also a group of feminists who then refer to it as sex work because it indicates that it belongs in the category of labor and it is language that is less patronizing, less stigmatizing, right? The term prostitution is a bit more contested. Um, it still has baggage that's associated with vice or crime, but at the same time, it has been reclaimed by some sex worker led organizations. So, two of the biggest sex worker led organizations in the world, the English Collective of Prostitutes and the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective, have basically reclaimed the term prostitution as a form of agentic labor. That doesn't mean they romanticize it, of course not. They recognize that it is precarious and vulnerable, but they reject the assumption that women who engage in it are, you know, doing it against their will. In Brazil, there's a very interesting move by the sex worker rights movement to reclaim the term puta, which is a derogatory term, which began as a derogatory term, but they embraced it and they said, well, out of this stigmatized term, we are going to uh, we're going to resist. We're going to build resistance from the very grounds of stigmatization. So they organize around something they call puta politics, right? Now, the World Health Organization, UNAIDS, the UN Population Fund, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, increasingly the International Labor Organization, all now use the term sex work. Now, I think the most common definition of sex work we will encounter is sex workers are consenting adults who receive material compensation in exchange for sexual services or erotic performances. It seems simple, but it's actually a really, really diverse sector that is kind of hard to uh, put in one box, right? So there's diversity in terms of the type of services being offered. So you have direct and full sexual services, that's like face to face, but uh, an actual like sexual acts. You also have escorting, you have pornography, which is more filmed, live sex shows, webcamming, phone sex, erotic dance. And so the types of services involved range from direct, expedient, and impersonal sexual acts, very transactional, to deeper and more intimate emotional and physical interaction. So you've heard of, the girlfriend experience or kind of like short-term engagement over a period of time where there's greater intimacy, where there's a focus on companionship and conversation in addition to direct sexual services. And individuals may engage in sex work regularly, it could be their full time thing, or just occasionally as part of a range of income generating activities. Like it might be just one of many. It could be discontinuous. They engage in it, they stop, they come back, right? Um, the other thing that makes sex work like quite complicated to study and think about is the conceptual boundaries, I think, and has been recognized in the scholarship, are somewhat blurry because there are continuities between sex work and the sexualization of work outside the sex industry, right? Like sex sells. So uh, models, Instagram influencers, so people who use some degree of sexual fantasy to sell things. Where do they fit here, right? Um, or even in the context of certain romantic or intimate relationships, so marriage, long-term partnerships, or this increasing industry called sugaring, where people agree to date people for financial allowance, right? They involve some form of monetary and gift exchanges, even if you ask the participants, they say they maintain boundaries between what they do and sex work. So as a theorist, what do you do with that? You don't want to impose categories on people who are rejecting these categories, but at the same time, you are also seeing continuities, right? So you kind of sit with that ambivalence. Or individuals who engage in sexual services or erotic performances in exchange for compensation who may refuse to identify as sex workers. They're just like, nope. And they instead describe themselves as performers or strippers or dancers or intimacy providers, but not sex workers. So, because the label has stigma, right? So, what do you do with that information is also hard. Okay. Ah, oops. All right. So, why am I bringing all these things together in conversation? What do we gain from this? So, first, it has already been theorized by scholars like Aileen Boris and Russell Perennias, for example, that all three are forms of intimate labor. They involve managing bodies, emotions, and desires, right? All three tend to be feminized. So it's not exclusively women performing them, especially domestic work, or even within the care sector. I mean, you have male nurses, right? You have male caregivers. Um, but it is predominantly women, especially at the lower ends of the occupational ladder, tend to be women. This work is undervalued. In the case of sex work, it's actually not seen as work in many cases, and morally policed. Now, the moral policing takes different shapes and forms, and we'll come to that in the next slide. But care is framed as selfless love. That sounds nice, but that also has a disciplinary dimension to it, right? Um, Domestic workers are seen as extensions of the family, and we'll unpack that in a bit. Sex work is seen as vice, right? So there are some forms of disciplining and management that's happening here that's quite gendered. So, what is the analytical value of kind of thinking of them together without flattening the distinctions? If we see them together, we uncover common logics of devaluation and gendered control. And from my own perspective as a scholar of sex work, that is my main focus. And I argue that sex work is structurally similar to a lot of these forms of work rather than uniquely different and exceptional in its own box, especially having worked with sex workers who have previously worked as domestic workers also. Seeing them in the same box kind of resists the tendency to isolate sex work as uniquely problematic. And at the same time, what usually happens is, you hear women being told, we are rescuing you from sex work. You should become domestic workers instead because somehow that is better. But then we kind of don't pay as much attention to exploitation in domestic and care work because at least it's not sex work, right? So these kind of divisions only serve the interest of capital because it then makes each category of worker a bit more exploitable. But at the same time, there are, of course, differences across these three. They are not the same. Each one has distinct histories, forms of regulation, and social movements, right? So this tension is also crucial. Okay. Now, let's talk about how specifically do gender, class, sometimes race, and in the context of India, definitely caste, underpin the definition and value of work. Because the argument I'm making here is the way work is defined, the way it is recognized, what is seen as legitimate work, what is seen as prestigious and valuable work, that's shaped by gender. And that also has gendered consequences, right? So let's talk a bit about care. Care is often framed as a moral obligation rather than work, right? In the household, it's kind of framed as, and it's very feminized, like this is something that mothers do or that sisters kind of reproduce. And even when it is paid, in industries such as nursing, childcare, elder care, in many Western economies, when you have dual income households, the way of relieving that is to pay for care. it is lower paid relative to its essential social value. And we saw this in the COVID pandemic, right? When everyone kept calling essential medical workers heroes, and there were all these like illustrations of them wearing capes and being life-saving. But at the same time, they weren't given access to protective equipment. They weren't being paid more. They were being overworked, right? And they were not being given autonomy. Like in the context of the Philippines, our government banned all our medical professionals from leaving the country, forcing them to serve the Philippines. Now, I understand where this was coming from, but it is ridiculous to do that in the context of a country that has always told its population to go and leave and migrate and send money back. That's what they were constantly told. And then suddenly this was stopped. Like so many of them kind of lost their contracts, but they weren't paid more, right? Um, so this kind of work that is seen as an entitlement and something that women should, especially women, should kind of just make available, right? So that's care. Now, domestic work historically has been relegated to servants. Today is often outsourced to migrant women. Um, it's often marked as unskilled, but that has always confused me because it actually demands complex skills like the ability to operate a wide range of appliances, the ability to engage with children and kind of manage children's personalities, combination of care and discipline, um, the ability to cook properly, the ability to kind of just run a household. That's pretty complex. And racialized hierarchies here are central. It's basically care is being outsourced. So as more women enter the labor force, especially in developed countries, then the caring obligations don't get shared between men and women. They are outsourced to women from global south context. So either global south countries or global south within, or the south within the north, right? Um, and that's the global care chains concept, essentially. And then obviously, sex work is a bit differently positioned relative to these things because it's often criminalized or hyper regulated, or sex workers are seen as victims and they are being rescued because they are seen as not knowing what is in their best interest, right? It is stigmatized as immoral, it's rarely seen as work, but at the same time, it generates immense profits for third parties. There are entire secondary industries that wouldn't be profitable if sex workers didn't exist. Brothel owners, hotels and motels, online platforms, local government tourism revenue. So governments of the Philippines, Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia, on paper will say that they oppose sex work, but in practice actually condone it because it brings in so much money. But because sex workers don't actually have access to legal rights and recognition, they have less control over their working conditions. So the profits actually go to all these other third parties, right? So the workers remain precarious. And so here you see the different ways. So it doesn't manifest in identical ways, but you see the different modalities in which gender, class, and race shape how work is valued or even how work is defined, right? So let's talk about this in more depth. Some of this I may have already foreshadowed. Um, so in this graph, you will see that uh, globally, when we are comparing employed persons, so men and women, so work by employed, we mean people in paid work, and then we look at the amount of time they spend in paid and unpaid work. So we're not talking about partners here who have no paid work. We're talking about both being in paid work. Women still carry out at least 2.5 times more unpaid household and care work than men. So you will see other graphs here. I just didn't want to overload this with graphs, but I wanted to introduce you to it. The ILO has published a lot of research on this. As you see, um, increasing rates of women joining the formal labor force. Of course, it's a different conversation what their position in the labor force is in the occupational segregation. Uh, and but as you see, increasing rates of women joining the labor force, it is not matched by the same rate of men sharing in housework. So that's where the whole double burden term comes in, right? Or the double, triple shift, even. So across all three, we see feminization at work. So women's labor is constructed as natural, abundant, and replaceable. Like there's a recent book published by Professor Shirin Rai, who is based in SOAS, entitled Depletion, The Costs of Caring, which I thought was really, really good. Um, Beyond feminization, you also see class logic. So this one is sometimes less obvious, right? Middle class households increasingly depend on the cheap labor of working class or migrant women. And migrant here doesn't just have to be international borders, it can be from rural areas to urban areas in the same country, which I think India experiences, China experiences, very common in the Philippines as well, right? So what's happening is reproductive work is being outsourced to those who are most precarious. But care and domestic work are seen as virtuous work. Even if they are still undervalued, they are seen as virtuous, right? Because domestic workers are seen as extensions of the family institution. You are simply sustaining a different family. And you are helping as a domestic worker with the gender and class mobility of the family you are serving, because the woman in that family can have an easier time going to work and being productive, right? And that entire family can improve themselves. And domestic workers then are also seen as improving the class family mobility of their own families back home. But ultimately, they are seen as sustaining the institution of the family. Sex work is slightly differently positioned again, because sex work is seen as a threat to the family. Well, they might be like seducing men away from monogamy, or they are also seen as, for those of you familiar with feminist literature on the patriarchal bargain, they are seen as transgressing the standard expectation on women to be sexually loyal and dependent on one man for protection. So that's the bargain, right? Like you give your loyalty to one man, he protects you and he financially provides for you. And so sex workers kind of disrupt that because they are not loyal to one man and in to some extent making money off their sexuality. But the objection to this is sex is intimacy. It shouldn't be commodified. But if you actually dig deeper there, the other thing is the assumption then is sex is always a gift. It's something that should be given for free, right? It shouldn't be a commercial transaction. But the terms on which married women or partnered women provide sex, that isn't always free. Sometimes it is coercive, or sometimes it is transactional, even if it isn't labeled as such, because they are financially dependent on their partners, right? Like, so in both situations, in rejecting sex work and idealizing domestic work, the assumption here is, women's labor is natural, it's abundant. It should be given for free or at a low value. And across all these industries, exploitation, abuse, sexual harassment, physical, emotional violence happens, right? Okay, so just sit with those things. I'm not trying to resolve anything in these lectures. I'm just trying to get us to see things in a slightly different way. There is another tension here, a struggle, even for me. And actually, I'm going to end with questions, not resolutions. Feminist movements have fought hard for recognition for many of these forms of labor. Not really sex work, they're very divided on sex work. But for domestic work and care work, they have fought for recognition. And some of them have fought for recognition for sex work. So obviously, recognition and visibility is really essential for rights, for protections, and for dignity, right? And one popular strategy to get recognition is to make visible and to emphasize the social value of care. Even in the context of sex workers, we always talk about them as good mothers and good daughters, and sex work is just helping them become better mothers to their kids by providing for them, right? And when we talk about the contributions of domestic workers to the household. But the problem is, and that's very politically palatable because it makes people sympathetic. But the double bind is if we define all feminized work in terms of care, A, we flatten differences, but B, we kind of reinforce this idea of women's service to others. Like it's quite essentialist. And even in the case of sex work, we recast sex work as a form of caring for men or as a form of good motherhood. But like we are creating hierarchies of respectability and deservingness again. Like, what if it's just a job to make money? Like, does it really have to be tied to care? So, and here's the bind, right? Domestic workers, they don't just want sentimental respect as part of the family. They want legal protections in the same way factory workers have legal protections against their capitalist employers, right? Why do we assume that domestic workers are not entitled to that? Sex workers do not just want to be seen as carers. They also want workers as recognition as workers. Care workers want both recognition and redistribution. So the wage part is also important, right? And that's why they were saying in the during the pandemic, stop calling us heroes, just pay us better, right? But they also struggle against the idea that women are more naturally oriented towards providing care. So how do we demand recognition and rights without reducing all feminized work to care, but also recognize care? Because you also don't want to devalue care. The point was it is devalued, right? So the questions I want to leave you with are, what would a political economy look like if we centered not just waged work, but the multiple, intimate, and contested labors that sustain life? Because the way we currently measure productivity doesn't capture any of this. Like, GDP is such a problematic way of measuring productivity. It just measures things that you have a record of being produced and consumed monetarily. So someone buys an egg in a shop, what is captured there is the money they paid for that egg. What is completely invisible in GDP is that person who went home and cooked that egg and fed it to their family, right? Like, there's so much invisible work that doesn't get captured in GDP. So are our measurements of progress actually even accurate? But at the same time, should we be seeking to measure and financially compensate? Sorry, there's a missing word. Should we be seeking to measure and compensate all forms of care and domestic work as well? And then how do we value care without romanticizing it? And how do we recognize sex work and domestic work without collapsing them into just care? And then how do we meet caring needs in an equitable way? And in certain contexts, caring needs are growing really, really fast because advances in medicine have meant that people are living longer. But then in many parts of the world, people are having fewer children. So the ability to kind of sustain that is crushing the system. But that's also because we have very bad models of care provision, right? And so that burden is being disproportionately borne by, by migrants, by women. And so how do we deal with that? Okay, I think I'm at like 33 minutes, so I'll stop now and turn over to the discussants. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sharmila. The points and questions you raised give us a lot to think through. I now request Dr. Devlina to yeah, give her remarks, reflections, comments.
Uh, Thank you so much, Dr. Huda, for inviting me, and Dr. Dipanshu Mohan also for giving me this platform. I really enjoyed Dr. Parmanand's lecture. It was very insightful and very layered in the way in which you talk about these three broadly, seemingly different categories of work, and also looking at the underlying similar capitalist patriarchal logics behind it. So I think this is a conversation, it's an ongoing conversation. It's really hard to, the questions that you've raised, they're extremely crucial. And I think a lot of conversation can be had around each of those questions in your last slide. And especially around the point about how do we value care without romanticizing it. So what I'm going to do is I'll try to I pick on a few points that you have made because I have pretty limited time. I think I'm going to talk about this point about altruism or selflessness in that is very deeply associated with care work, and for that matter, with sex work and domestic work, which sort of downplays the idea of choice. And this idea of selflessness is so deeply entrenched and built into these forms of different forms of care work, which is sort of cunningly used by the heteropatriarchal capitalist systems, and in fact, so deeply entrenched in the psyche of the workers themselves. I was thinking about um, a particular form of sexualized care work, that is surrogacy, where the worker has an additional burden of dealing with moral tensions of it being a stigmatized form of labor, much like sex work. There's a lot of parallel that one draws um, between sex work and surrogacy. And this idea of renting the womb to carry someone else's child is laden with moral connotations. And uh, what I find is that often, and there's a lot of literature which tells us that how surrogates often use neutralizing vocabularies like calling it majburi or helplessness, some kind of an economic necessity, the fact that they have to bring up their children, so they're working to earn the money to give a better livelihood, life to their children, or calling it tapasya or some kind of a calling, and just explaining that kind of work in terms of how they're actually doing a favor to another couple who are who a childless couple basically, and also comparing their labor to the kind of pain that is endured when you're undergoing that tapasya or that form of renunciation. Um, so I was just wondering, how can care work be a site of resistance to oppression? A question that I think you are also engaging with. So is it only collective mobilization, or could it also be carried out at an individual level? And can those be sustained? So I'm just thinking of, how does one talk about it as individualistic strategies or techniques of um, resisting these forms of oppression? So that was one thing that came to my mind. The other thing that I was also thinking about is the linkage between the differential valuation of labor in society and the harms of violence against women, particularly because, as you also said, that most of these works are undertaken by women in very precarious positions. So I'm just thinking that how this hierarchization of value of labor in society is again so deeply entrenched in the social fabric and even the heterosexual familial space that ends up recreating these normative ideas about women's labor. And not just that, the married woman, uh, her mobility, her life decisions are often controlled in the name of family's honor. Uh, so the honor is often related to the kind of work that the woman does. I was thinking about this recent dowry murder case of Nikki Bhatti, who was in her late 20s. And of course, this case is under investigation currently, but it, I think, raises important questions about agency and victimhood in the context of heterosexual matrimonial relationships, considered to be, again, an ideal socially sanctioned relationship to be in, really, in comparison to, say, something like sex work or in the framework of surrogacy, surrogate labor. So the particular point of the reason I mentioned about this case is, when I was reading the newspapers, one of the things that was often mentioned is about how there was an altercation just before her death, which is allegedly, I mean, the argument is whether it was because of an accidental cylinder blast, or whether it was a homicidal burning by or a murder by the husband or her in-laws. The point that I'm trying to make is that she with her sister, who's married into the same family, wanted to run a beauty parlor business, but there was a lot of opposition by her husband. So um, women's financial independence is often seen as threatening the patriarchal structure that rests on a strict gender division of labor in and outside the matrimonial home. And of course, um, this this idea of women's honor or female respectability is deeply problematic, and we know that this dishonor um, of working in a beauty parlor or massage center and places like that does not really come from the work itself, but it's symbolic associations with with public visibility of the woman in amid strangers and bodily intimacy with strangers and so on. So I was just thinking of the basically the labeling techniques that's used by society and the governability of such women's labor and its association with violence. So that was another point. I don't know if I have any more point, because I had just one more point about the risks I was thinking about, but I can continue after Dr. Ruchira Sen has completed her point. I might have completed my 10 minutes. Dr. Huda, should I
You
continue or
have
should I?
a minute or two. Yeah, yeah. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. So I was just thinking about the risks that are posed um, in when women undertake these different forms of work. While some of the work is, I think, the way in which Dr. Parmanand defined domestic work, for example, is also the paid work, right? So I can safely say that, I'm going to talk about the risks where that are encountered by women more in the public domain. So you're doing care work in the public domain. And the sex work, or be it the care work, domestic work, it involves encounters with other men or other people. And whenever we talk about risks to women in the public discourse, I think there is a kind of condescending approach about her protection and safety, and that kind of a language is evoked, right? And I was thinking in terms of um, Shilpa Phadke's and others, their book, Why Loiter? Women at Risk on Mumbai Streets, where they talk about loitering as a feminist strategy to sort of reclaim the space. And there has been a lot of movement, feminist movement and articulation about reclaiming the space, reclaiming the night, and so on. And I bring this particularly in the context of care work because um, it's not just the place of work, but the whole navigation through the city to the place of work is filled with a lot of challenges and hassles, right? So, how could we maybe think of reclaiming the city in the context of care work? I was also thinking about how, in my own work with elder care workers, I often found that the women care workers, I'm talking about in the context of a care company which provided home-based care services. I've often found that the women care workers would often be allotted to clients who did not require emergency care. That would entail, running around, making arrangements at odd hours. So why not talk about freeing up space to accommodate care workers? Who are precariously positioned anyway, and why do they have to um, deal with this additional burden of being time bound in their work, and so on, because they do care work at home. I mean, the time boundedness comes again, is linked to their precarious position and the double burden, triple burden of work, which is associated with the fact that they also have to go back and do work at home. And also, they are generally considered vulnerable to crime. So, anyway, these are the social constructs I think we need to problematize. And it was great listening to Dr. Parmanand. Thank you so much for the lecture, and I end here for the time being.
Thank you so much, Dr. Devlina. Your comments, your remarks were really interesting and insightful. I now request Dr. Ruchira to please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hudda, and thank you, Dr. Parmanand, for the very, very insightful talk and particularly that frame which brings together these different kinds of work, care, sex, domestic work. I have a few quarrels, but I'll come to that. Thank you, Dr. Dey, for your comments. Always great to meet you and talk to you anyway. Yeah, so first I'll make in good feminist tradition, let me make my own positionality clear. One is that, in economics, because I'm an economist, there are several schools of thought. And with neoliberalism, the neoclassical school of thought has become, it has become economics. To the point, for instance, if you walk into a neoclassical economics department and you ask them, okay, in neoclassical economics, and they'll say, what is that? Because, for them, neoclassical economics is economics. And there are marginalized streams which look at economics, like Marxist economics. Feminist economics is somewhat between uh, the marginalized schools and the mainstream schools, so I'll come to that. But this is my positionality as an economist. There's some more positionality, which is that I'm a single parent. So that I think is relevant to this discussion as well. Okay, so we began, of course, with the Himmelweit definition, which, of course, is one of the primary definitions of care. Himmelweit also looks at, like the way she defines care is often also trying to, like, she's saying it should be paid work and so on. So the reason why she positions it that way is to position it vis-a-vis, could this be done in the market and would it be paid a fee? And that then informs Folbray and much of Bitman and much of that project to include the wage given to domestic workers as a way to measure unpaid care work, right? So that's coming from there. And then work becomes, is it something that could be done in the market? Right. Now, I'm looking at, now suppose we look at work and gift and leisure a little differently. Suppose work is seen from the broader angle of social reproduction. What allows society to reproduce itself? Not necessarily what allows society to accumulate or grow, but, subsistence, in the words of Maria Mies. What about work as the work of social reproduction, the Nancy Folbray idea of work? And there, I think even there we have an argument to talk about care work as work and sex work as work. But now care becomes a little broader. It becomes not just the care of personal services provided, to people, but care then becomes a task of social reproduction. But now the trouble is it broadens care, and as you rightly said, Dr. Parmanand, it then flattens out the differences. But I think there might be some merit in that. Like, say, for instance, now IIT Kharagpur has gone around saying that women faculty members have to be campus moms, and we have to provide yeah, and we have to provide emotional services and basically be de facto therapists to students. And that is in wake of students also going through a lot of mental and the great stress that comes from being in an IIT. uh, but I do find, in fact, and this might be, apart IIT Kharagpur aside, they are just formalizing. It's a bad way of recognizing care labor, but they are formalizing what was actually happening also, where women faculty members, women staff members have for years, been serving as unqualified, unpaid therapists, possibly. So, and teaching labor or even the labor of being a professor is never really seen as care work, and yet it is required for the task of social reproduction. The idea of mass production is well taken, but I also feel like even that could be part of a broader frame as well, because mass production of anything lowers the quality. It isn't really just care work. Um, and I also wanted to look at, the idea of gift. So, like the idea of sex as a gift, of care as a gift. Gift is not something non-transactional. In fact, Maus was very clear about that from the very beginning of all literature on gift work. And in fact, I got into a lot of trouble once because I wrote my essay on, the dowry as a gift, and I also talked about, the non-reciprocality of it. It need not necessarily be reciprocal because of that patriarchal structure. Uh, so even gifts are usually reciprocal, and when they are not because of some very peculiar kind of patriarchal arrangement behind it, saying, like, say, it is the requirement of a father of a daughter to give his daughter up in marriage, and if he does not, he is keeping the original sin. He is not passing the original sin off. And many dowry scholars have also said that it's not, daughters are not a burden because of dowry, as neoclassical economics would put it, but daughters, you end up giving dowry because daughters are seen as the original sin in the Hindu framework from the very beginning. That then makes dowry a little unusual. It's like, I call it the dowry exceptionalism. It's an unusual gift, but by and large, gifts are also reciprocal. Yeah, I'll stop there. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ruchira. You flagged some really interesting issues that I'm sure a lot of us had not thought through before we just, got into this, video. So we can now maybe open it up for Q&A. The participants can maybe unmute themselves or maybe put in their questions in the chat box. Any questions, remarks, reflections, it's all welcome. Yes, Shubhangi, please go ahead.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for Dr. Parmanand for this lecture and presentation, and it was it was quite thought provoking. And I'm not sure like if my like comments can be really classified as like questions or reflections. I guess like they're both, because these are such complex themes, and it's really difficult to sort of think from a very solution oriented approach in this broad and complex theme. But I just a couple of things that came to my mind while all three of you were talking about different sub themes and layers in this lecture. One, I was thinking about like how I think the problem sort of also lies in how we see how we sort of categorize skills as also like hard skills and soft skills. And how usually like especially like women, domestic workers, caregivers, mothers, sisters, they're very easily sort of clubbed under like all of these are soft skills that come with it, which then I think sort of lead to invisibilization of their labor and work. I was also thinking about like how married unemployed women, they've all like they are labeled as like housewives, and I've been thinking about this etymology and this terminology of like housewives, and just looking at my mother also, who is like quote unquote a housewife, and the kind of work and the depth of work and the vastness of work that she's engaged in, like she has been engaged in throughout. And I was having this discussion with my father once, and it came up from it came from him, and it sort of stuck that that she is more of a manager, like a house manager. So like, and that transition from like housewife to like a house manager, and how can we also start seeing like them as more of house managers? Can that sort of bring in the legitimacy that is missing from the from all the overwork that sort of their labor involves? And then another thing that I was thinking about when uh, uh, the professor was mentioning about surrogacy, and the question of choice that comes in. So even before that, I was thinking about like how, like in sex work also, like how sex work and prostitution has, there's always been that question of choice, and that it is done out of necessity, which is very prevalent in movies also, in cinema, that we see. It's very rare that we get to see this narrative of seeing this as a personal choice, as so just like wondering if it can ever be seen as a legitimate source of livelihood and not just out of necessity, and how does it then become different when men are also engaged in sex work, which is, I know that the proportion is quite less, and it's mostly like women and trans workers, trans people. But then when we talk about like when men are engaged in offering sex as work, then what are the differences that sort of come in? Is it treated the same way as when women are engaged in sex work? Because I am, from my understanding and from how I've seen it in pop culture and media also, it's quite different, and it's not that devaluation. The degree of devaluation is much higher when when it's the women, when it's a woman sex worker. Yeah, just I guess I had some of these questions and reflections, and I'd be happy to hear from any of them on these thoughts. Yeah, thank you.
Should we take more questions and then maybe you can respond, or should we go like, would you like to respond after each question? How would you like to go about it?
How much time do we have, just to be sure?
Maybe we can like wind up in the next 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, by 1:15.
I guess we can take at least one more question, right? Like,
Yeah. In case there's any other questions, guys, can you please unmute? Sanika has put in a question in the chat box. Should I read it out loud? Yeah, she says, "Thank you for the talk, Dr. Parmanand. To just wanted to get an idea that what was the reason of researching on this particular topic that is generally ignored in the society." Yeah, if there's nothing else, I just had a very childlike, innocent question, maybe if that can be addressed in any way. I know it's whenever we talk of care work, it seems like a very reductionist question. So, which relates to, how do we conceptualize this radical idea of care? I mean, I've read some bits of Alison Ware and Stoltenberg and others, but just your take, the three of you, like, how would you radically conceptualize something like care? And maybe that is where we can end. Yeah, thank you.
I could quickly answer the sex work question, specific ones, and then maybe talk a little bit about radical care. But I also don't want to talk too much because I really enjoyed listening to, Deblina and Ruchira also. Very quickly, why was I very interested in researching sex work? Guilt. Because I used to work in a leading, high-ranking position in an anti-trafficking organization in the Philippines that was funded by the US government, and working closely with the police. And the approach to sex work was basically rescue them all, like move them to other forms of feminized work, like factory work and domestic work. And so we would be part of rescuing all these women who didn't want to be rescued. And 2 weeks later, they'd be back in the brothels. But then some of them were kind of put in shelters against their will, and they were adult women, right? And they were incredibly resentful. They were just like, we don't want to be here. This is time that we could be earning money for our kids. This is incredibly dehumanizing. Do you feel better now? Do you sleep better at night knowing you've handed me a broom? Why is the kitchen better than a bar? So like, they would really push back. And there I was thinking I was doing great things, right? And I was like, look, we rehabilitate and rescue people. And they were like, did you ever speak to us about, this? And there was like this happened, and increasingly I realized I might actually be causing harm, even if my intentions are good. And I don't know that I actually understand sex work without actually speaking to sex workers. So that's kind of where it started. I reached out to the Philippine Sex Workers Collective, and they were very, what are you doing here? And I eventually changed directions and moved to academia because it is very hard to research these questions in a civil society space where you are beholden to donor-driven agendas and incentives of government actors. So academia kind of, I'm not romanticizing academia, there are many problems with it, but it kind of provided a bit of an autonomous space to think about this, right? Male sex work, really interesting question. I do think the dynamic is a bit different, just in terms of like safety practices or whether clients would be more willing to take advantage of a male sex worker versus the other way around. So the exposure to danger, I think we do need to acknowledge that. I don't think there's the same kind of moral panic around male sex work as there is around women engaging in sex work. But at the same time, we are assessing sex work as it is currently happening, right? Given the criminalization and the vulnerability and the income gap between men and women. It's hard to conclude in a future where if sex work were decriminalized, if it were safer, if it were destigmatized, it's hard to say that men wouldn't get in there as well, right? Like it's hard to say that. So to some extent, the situation is a result of also like self-perpetuation. And there is an increasing market of men in sex work, but there's a strong resistance to being called sex workers. They would prefer to not use that label. And in terms of radical care, I was really excited when Deblina mentioned this actually, because yeah, I think care is resistance. Like all of this kind of conversation around challenging hyper productivity, challenging conceptions of people being reduced to their professional worth and how much money they are making, I think is quite important. Or sometimes even recognizing that a lot of the work we do, we're not going to see major changes in our lifetime. But in order to be able to sustain that kind of resistance, we need to care for each other and we need to do it collectively. Otherwise, we will run out of steam, right? Like, and that's resistance and that's radical. But I'll stop here because I also want to hear what the others have to say.
Thank you, Dr. Sharmila. Maybe we can now move on to Dr. Devlina and Dr. Ruchira for their final comments.
Richard, do you want to go ahead first?
Sure. Yeah, so how do we radicalize care? And that's the big question, right? I mean, there are lots of ways that have been put forward in the literature as well. Like, one, of course, is, how do we hold space for one another? As Dr. Parmanand was saying, right? When we actually care for one another in a very productivity driven world, then in a way that's also a way of being properly human, right? Like you can't and in fact in Japan I believe there is this major crisis of care which is occurring because of the rapidly aging population. But there's also a very lonely population, with, creating a demand for all kinds of work. In fact, I sometimes wish I could, what is that? When you don't have, say, a son, then you can, employ someone to be your son for a day or something. I mean, that is happening across Japan. I mean, I often feel it myself sometimes, when I go to a school event, my son's school event, and everybody else has got mother, father, and child in the middle, and I'm like the only one wearing this fancy sari by myself with my child. I sometimes think that, and of course, I'm getting stared at and like wondering, Rishi doesn't have a father. That does happen a lot. So I sometimes start thinking, should I like, find somebody to come with me just to, take the scrutiny off. So in that sense, there is, of course, that relationship that occurs between care and the market. And we have to recognize the many people in the market who are doing this crucial work. But we also have to recognize the many people out of the market who are also doing this crucial work. In radical feminism, there was this idea that marriage is legalized prostitution. Of course, there are lots of quibbles with that as well. Um, but like, how much is there enough discussion in our society as to how much marriage may harm women, or the kind of violence that exists in marriages, the discussion of domestic violence, but also not just the physical violence, there is the emotional violence of it. For instance, somebody constantly cutting down at you, reducing your self-worth. That there is that kind of gaslighting, of course, as in the Alfred Hitchcock movie. So, that kind of emotional violence also exists. And, there's also this idea in feminism that all women are workers. But, for women who constantly face this kind of gaslighting, constantly are made to doubt themselves as workers, and it's a type of labor rights violation. Recently, the IDWA did a session of women and indebtedness. They call it the Microfinance Institutes. It was a big public event, and there were a number of testimonials that women came from different states, and they came and spoke out about the kind of indebtedness they are facing and how they are tackling the collection agents and so on. But one thing that stood out across the discussions is how a lot of women were facing indebtedness because, there'll be this man who marries them, then he will leave, then they don't know what to do. They'll find some other man who will also, leave them with the burden of the loan on them. So marriage is, or how women are treated in marriages and in relationships, is actually a labor issue, and we don't often recognize that. So I think that that's something, I mean, I think we need to create a different way of just looking at social science. Look at social science as if emotions matter, as if intimate spaces, intimate violence, intimate work, intimate labor matters. So yeah, that will cause a radicalization of care.
Thank you, Dr. Ruchira. Dr. Devina, if you'd like to go ahead. There's also, just to point out, there's another question in the chat box if you'd like to take a look at it and also incorporate it in your response. Yeah, thank you.
I think I'll just very quickly respond to the radicalization of care idea. It's something that, of course, Dr. Parmanand and Dr. Sen have spoken about in terms of. I mean, there is a lot of feminist literature which talks about this, the fallacy of looking at these care and as if it were just in the realm of the private and citizenship, matters of justice being in the domain of the public, and this dichotomy between autonomy that is created, like you're a productive person, and only then you are valued. If not, so the idea of I mean the liberal individualism basically, which extols the idea of autonomy and completely sidelines interdependence. So that is where I'm getting at. I think interdependence is a very radical idea, and much like what Du Bois says, that we probably can think of bringing about radicalization of care through some kind of quote unquote tentative experiments. I think he uses that phrase, where he talks about these fragile trial and error sort of efforts that African Americans would take to build new democratic structures. And I think a lot of a similar example of that, that kind of tentative experimentation could be found during the pandemic period, where communities of care was springing up very organically, and something which Ruchira, Dr. Sen was also saying about how we don't have to look only at the market or at the state to talk about care work. So I think communities have a great role to play, and but then again, I'm also thinking about how the site of care work can also be a site of resistance at a more individual level. Can it be done and sustained? So that's something that I don't have an answer to, but I'll just stop here for the time being.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Day. Since
I-
there's another question, if
I
it's
can
more about
quickly address
yeah.
Nihalika's question, because I think, it's a question on everyone's minds. Like, when we talk about, oh, we shouldn't romanticize it, but if we don't romanticize it, then how will it ever be valued at all? And, if it's already seen as dirty work and low class labor, and if we don't romanticize it, we don't rewrite those scripts, then what do people have left? And then we fall into epistemic despair. So I think it's a good question. I don't have all the answers, but what I will say is, it is possible, and unions have shown us the way here, right? The unions movement. It is possible to insist in the dignity of one's work and to take pride in one's work and in doing it well without overly internalizing capitalist obedience. You know what I mean? Like obedience to productivity, to capitalism. So in sex work, I'll give you an example. The type of sex worker, kind of hyper empowered sex work activist that I really have a problem with. So, someone who goes, I hustle really well. Look at my life. I'm so well traveled. I can afford everything. I am in control of my working conditions. Life is great. And I'm like, you are the 1%, if that is even true, right? Like, in reality, this work is messy, difficult, dangerous, precarious. That's the situation of most people in this work. So let's not romanticize it. That's exactly why people are fighting for rights, right? But it doesn't mean that if the work is exploitative, there is no dignity in it. So it's kind of like, a lot of this will depend on our discursive strategies and our rhetorical strategies of how we frame the work. But we can learn from unions. It's valuable work. We should never, never disparage it, right? Or say that it's not important. But to romanticize it is dangerous, because that is that is ceding the ground to capitalists, who will then say, oh, well, then you're happy and you're rewarded, why do we need to pay you more, right? But I agree with you that we shouldn't take away people's hope. It is important work. In terms of sex work, just very, very briefly, this is a really complicated, long debate. There is one side that thinks that there is something exceptional about sex, and I don't actually know if I disagree with them. Something exceptional about sex that makes it different from other types of labor, right? So it's a continuum, but sex work is on this side of the continuum that is harmful, just because of how central sex is to our identity. That might not be inherent or natural, but that is so culturally deep seated that it might as well be inherent and natural, right? The way we experience sex is different from the way we experience having a coffee with someone or cleaning their house. So the level of self that is involved in that transaction and personhood that is involved in that transaction is greater than in other transactions, which means then that the level of dehumanization and objectification that happens is greater, which then means that because it is gendered, the level of gendered violence is greater, right? This is the argument they will make. There are many counter arguments to this. Like, sex workers will not necessarily describe their work in this way. Some of them might say that is the way it is because that is how it is being seen and framed, but we are negotiating it differently. Or even if it is that way, we still think this is a better option for us than other options. So unless you improve social protection, this is what we have. So it is from a harm minimization perspective. Like, there's so many arguments, and I'm not doing justice to them, but I kind of tried to just address your question.
there another question, or should we call it a day? Someone has unmuted themselves. Yeah, I think yeah. we can go ahead. I'd just like to thank all of you, Dr. Parmanand, Dr. Sen, Dr. Day. It was a very, very interesting, insightful session. I'm sure the participants had a great time listening to your comments, your arguments. And I would really like to thank everyone who attended, who contributed through their questions, through their comments. Thank you so much for this. Thank you.